Greetings from Pintpot. Welcome to my latest edition of Climbing the Curve, a series intended to make you the hunter, rather than the hunted, a little faster. Today I'm going to be taking a look at the Infiltrator updates. Now the latest patch has introduced some new abilities, such as the Stalker Cloak and the Motion Spotter. I'll take a look at these and the potential effects they will have on the wider game. Now the first thing to consider is the overall buff to the stealth capabilities of the Infiltrator Cloak. Now the patch notes state that the overall visibility of cloaks has been decreased, but in practice, what does this look like? Well, the answer is, for a stationary target, they're pretty damn hard to see, but when moving they remain relatively easy to spot. Now in a game where many players express concern over the strength of SMG infiltrators, this looks like an unwarranted buff. After all, it's pretty much widely accepted that the easiest infantry class to pick up one or two cheap kills with is an SMG infiltrator. With the cloak buffed, all other things being equal, it should be even easier than before. However, all other things are not equal, and the thing which is no longer equal are the number of abilities which can detect motion and therefore infiltrators, and I'll expand on this a little later. Now the two key new abilities of the infiltrator are the Stalker Cloak and Motion Spotter. Now the Stalker Cloak gives the same degree of camouflage as a default Hunter Cloak. However, unlike the Hunter Cloak, it only uses energy when you're cloaked and moving. It then regenerates energy either when you uncloak, just like the Hunter Cloak, or when you stop moving and the Stalker Cloak is still on. In other words, you can remain cloaked effectively permanently, provided you're patient when approaching the target. However, the Stalker Cloak has a large downside that when equipped you cannot use your primary weapon. In other words, you're trading increased stealth capability for decreased firepower. In addition, it takes longer than the Hunter Cloak to recharge, 12 seconds at max rank, whereas with the Hunter Cloak at max rank it's 8 seconds. So in practice, how does this new ability work out? Well, one thing it does do is open the door to a different sort of playstyle for the Infiltrator. Rather than being pigeonholed into a rather fast frenetic playstyle using the Hunter Cloak and an SMG, you can have a much more paced and measured ambush orientated playstyle. The SMG is often forced into encounters because its shield is running out. This does not happen with the Stalker Cloak, which is a good job because you're only using a secondary weapon, you're effectively in terms of firepower at a disadvantage. Therefore, choosing your target and your timing carefully are of paramount importance. And this is obviously crucial in terms of balancing this much stronger cloaking shield. You now have a luxury of choosing your encounters much more, but you need that luxury as your firepower is relatively speaking weak. So is this ability going to change the face of the game? Well, I think you'll see a bunch more infiltrators just hanging around in Stalker Cloak waiting to ambush. But ultimately, I don't think it's going to make a big difference to the flow of the game. I personally am more concerned about the potential impact of the buffed cloak on SMG infiltrators. They already have the capability to wreck pretty hard, making them even less visible will potentially make it much harder to counter them. And I say potentially because I am less concerned about this because of the sheer number of recon devices which are being introduced to the game, which I'll go into a little more later. So, should new players be looking to invest in the Stalker Cloak? I would say for the small investment to get rank 1, it's worth a whirl, particularly because it has a very different playstyle than the other cloaks. However, giving the Stalker Cloak a whirl comes up against a particular problem I see with this build, and that is what sidearm to use. And here I think there's a potential faction imbalance. The TR specific weapons get much larger magazines than the other faction. These larger magazines allow the Infiltrator to engage multiple targets in a way they can't with smaller magazine guns. Therefore, I'm hoping that Zoe is going to keep a close eye on how the TR Stalker Cloak build performs relative to other factions. Now the other issue is that you're going to have to engage at multiple ranges with just a sidearm. Therefore, very close range focused guns such as a Desperado do not strike me as the right weapon for this build. Personally, I found the Commissioner did the best job by some margin. But for new players, as it's expensive getting access to new pistols, they're stuck with the default. Therefore, what you can get out of this build is very much dependent on how much you like your default sidearm. Now the other key new ability is the Motion Spotter. Equipping this replaces your recon device, i.e. no darts. To use it, you place it pretty much like a squad beacon, and it gives you information about any enemy movement within a certain radius. It can also be destroyed by the enemy, much like a squad beacon. However, the key difference it has with the recon device is the amount of information it provides to your side. Unlike the recon device, which just provides a red dot where the enemy are, it shows you what direction the enemy is facing and whether or not they're infantry or a max. And in practice, this makes ambushing or flanking the enemy much easier. In addition, the duration of the motion spotter is much longer than a dart. At base level it's 120 seconds, and this can be upgraded to 240. So, when best to use the motion spotter and when the recon device? Well, the motion spotter excels when defending fixed points, and there are a number of reasons for this. Its duration is long enough to stay up for an entire cap. It provides better information in the recon dart about any enemy attacking, and once placed it doesn't require the infiltrator to have any more interaction. However, when attacking, the recon device is much more practical. This is because you can deploy it at distances by shooting them. For the motion spotter, you give away your location when you put it down, and you can only have one motion spotter down at any one time, unlike recon darts where you can effectively spam them across an entire base. One thing I noticed in particular is that when placing the motion spotter, I had a nasty tendency of getting killed just afterwards. Therefore, placing them within safe locations in a defensive point is much better. So, should a new player be looking to invest in them? My feelings are yes, but only up to rank 1. And the reason why is this. At lower ranks, the recon dart has a relatively short duration and limited ammo capacity. This means that it's very difficult for an infiltrator to keep up darts over a capture point unless they're literally standing on top of an ammo pack. However, at rank 1, the duration of the motion spotter is 120 seconds. This is relative to 20 seconds for recon darts at rank 1. This means that at rank 1 motion spotter, where you carry 2 such devices, you can keep up motion detection for the entire duration of a cap on a small base. When you couple this with the increased information you get from the motion spotter relative to a dart, makes it a much more formidable choice in defensive situations. Therefore, with a small investment of 30 certs to get rank 1 motion spotter allows you to have both an offensive build with recon darts and a defensive build with the motion spotter. And the motion spotter device is not the only new device capable of detecting infiltrators. One of these new devices is the new updated flashlight. The way it works is if you turn on the flashlight and point it towards an infiltrator who's cloaked, they will be illuminated if they're within 10 meters of you. However, there are a number of practical problems with using this attachment. Firstly, if you run it on your primary weapon, you're giving up whatever other attachment you had, be it a foregrip or a laser sight. If you run it with a pistol, then you're going to be forced to engage an infiltrator if you found them with your pistol, not your primary weapon, which would be fine provided you get the element of surprise. But the whole point of the flashlight is it has a large shining beam coming out of it, so it will be no surprise to the infiltrator that you're going to find them when you switch it on. Therefore, it's going to be really obvious to an infiltrator that you're on the hunt for them. Therefore, if you manage to find them, they're probably going to already be decloaking, ready for the attack. So you're going to end up with your pistol versus either their pistol or potentially an SMG, which is probably not going to work out well for you. So you have a bit of a dilemma. You run it on a pistol and just take the risk you're going to end up against an SMG infiltrator, or run it on your primary weapon and give up all the utility you can get from the other attachments. Also, another negative is it's not like you can just leave it on when running around the battlefield. The flashlight illuminates your presence and therefore makes you a really easy target. So you only want to switch it on when you actually know there's an infiltrator there, which with the new Stalker Cloak is not necessarily the case. So all in all, I think it's actually pretty rubbish. The only time I can really see a great use for this is if you're a group and you're hunting for an infiltrator. That way, if you've got your pistol out, it doesn't matter so much because lots of other people are there to shoot them. Now onto a development of much more significance: the crossbow's explosive and recon dart options. Now the crossbow per se doesn't really change balance in any respect. It's a hard-hitting, slow-firing weapon. But it also comes with the option to change out its ammo to either explosive darts or recon darts. And it is these which potentially have the most impact upon balance. So let's briefly consider explosive bolts. Now the Infiltrator is the only class with no anti-armor capacity. They don't have access to C4 for the rather obvious reason that it would be incredibly hard to counter an Infiltrator C4ing a vehicle. but now they have access to crossbows with explosive bolts, they do finally have some capability in terms of anti-armor. However, when you take a look at the times to kill and the number of shots to kill, you'll see that this is unlikely to be much of an issue. The only target with even a remotely sensible time to kill is against an ESF, and given the slow projectile velocity, it is of very little threat to flying ESFs. Therefore, the only sensible role I can see this weapon fitting into is being able to finish off tanks which are already on fire, which is potentially useful but hardly game breaking. Of more concern is the recon dart. Using the crossbow, now all classes have access to the recon dart, which in theory could have massive implications. The classes most reliant on not being detected, the Light Assault and the Infiltrator, are particularly vulnerable to this development. But how does it work in practice? Well, the crossbow's recon dart has the same strength as the lowest level Infiltrator recon dart. It covers a radius of just 25 meters. In addition, it only has a duration of 10 seconds, half what the baseline recon dart has. So is this sufficiently potent to have any impact on overall balance? Well, I've been principally trying this out on my Heavy Assault, for the simple reason that the Heavy Assault is much less reliant than the other classes on its secondary weapon, as its LMG has a much larger capacity. It also addresses one of the fundamental weaknesses of the Heavy Assault, that its lack of mobility allows it to be flanked. And what I found is that it is essentially situational. In those instances where you know there's an enemy in a certain region, such as around a control point, it becomes incredibly useful. But owing to the small radius and short duration, it doesn't allow you the potency of the recon device in terms of getting blanket coverage over an area. So its presence doesn't negate the worth of the Infiltrator's motion spotter or recon devices, but it can potentially have an impact on the balance for those class switches are reliant on either stealth or flanking to be viable, i.e. the Infiltrator and the Light Assault. So is this balanced? I would say more or less, though I do have my concerns about the Heavy Assault having access to it, as they have relatively few weaknesses as it is. Now, while each of these recon devices or detect devices seems to be balanced in isolation, what concerns me is the potential impact of a cumulative effect of all of them being introduced. Now, for the Infiltrator, who got a buff to their cloaking, it seems one more or less offsets the other. But for the Light Assault, whose viability is based upon flanking, they get no such offsetting buff. Since the update, particularly in areas where there's a motion spotter down, I've found that the Light Assault becomes incredibly vulnerable. Effectively, the entire advantage of the class is negated. Therefore, I hope Zoe is keeping a close eye on Light Assault's performance before and after this patch to see if there's been any deterioration in their overall competitiveness. So, in conclusion, the new Stalker Cloak opens up a new form of play for the Infiltrator, which I think is an interesting development. However, in terms of game balance, I think the changes are situational rather than game changing, with one caveat, which is the potential impact upon the Light Assault. Now, my next episode I'll be taking a look at the various cert lines for squad leaders, plus putting forward a few ideas of how this cert line may be improved. If you found this episode interesting or useful, please feel free to thumbs up, thumbs down, comment or subscribe as appropriate. In the meantime, have a good one, happy hunting, and Pintpot out.